We're going to just try to do a quick recap of what we covered here last time. Again, we're trying to really unpack the what it's like, I guess, to be a human being, or what in what way is a human or a person, what is the nature of their way of being in the world? We talked about Martin Heidegger and how he's effectively kind of railing against René Descartes, who suggested that, our way of being is a res cogitans, a thinking substance, over against like a world of objects, and then you got the subject-object split, and how these two things relate to each other, and all these pseudo problems and whatnot. And Heidegger is, and I guess the other thing worth mentioning is, when we talk about mind and we talk about consciousness, there are all kinds of philosophical baggage that's kind of bound up in that. So Heidegger's wanting to break free of all that stuff, and he introduces the term Dasein to describe the way of being of persons. So Dasein is translated as being there, or you can think of it as being here. And so Dasein effectively dwells within a world, right? Dasein is the world is part of Dasein, and Dasein is part of the world, at least the world that humans are able to encounter and experience. And it's fundamentally a world of a preconceptual familiarity, right? That we dwell within various skills, we dwell within a language, and again, we are thrown into this world. We didn't choose it, and we don't encounter the world as some detached thinking entity, right? You come into the world as an infant, and very quickly you just pick up these social practices, right? You don't think about why you're doing it or what it's for or anything like that. You just, it's just something that you take up somewhat unthinkingly. We talked about, again, we dwell within a referential totality of the ready to hand. The ready to hand is effectively what you can take up in use without, some conceptual, representational kind of understanding always alongside that use. So again, you come in here, you navigate through the classroom, you find yourself to a seat, you're not thinking about, what the seat is for or what you're going to do with it or anything like that. You're eating your cereal in the morning, you're probably thinking about, something that you're watching on television or what you're going to, do it later on during the day. All of that, the background practices, the understanding what the fork or the knife or the spoon is for, all that just gets absorbed into the background. It's part of that background activity. We have this, it's taken up as ready-to-hand equipment. And equipment, though, it's not just, physical entities. Equipment in the sense is language, that we use language oftentimes just in trading in these concepts and ideas without kind of staring at the words in this disinterested scientific mode, right? It's just a part of our way of being. So again, we dwell within the world, we are absorbed within the world in this referential sense, in this symbolic sense. And this is really important to try to wrap your head around. You might be wondering, well, how does all this stuff relate to personality and what we're trying to do here? This is a fundamental, metaphysical assumptions that we want to get straight. We want to get straight what we mean by causality, and what we want to get straight the kind of being of a person. If we get some of that stuff straightened out, then it opens up a whole new world of understanding as it relates to emotions. Like, what the hell are emotions? So are emotions just some material efficient neurological process, some kind of firing of events in the nervous system, or is there something kind of more complex going on here that we need to understand? What is our way of relating to other people, other human beings, right? And so if you understand, or you kind of get in some toehold on some of these metaphysical issues, it opens up a whole different way of understanding other phenomena as it relates to personality, okay? We talked about two different kinds of intentionality. So it's not like one is right and one is incorrect. They're both different modes of being. So we have a representational level of intentionality that we can have, an awareness of ourselves thinking thoughts about things or about concepts, and thinking thoughts about thoughts, and thinking thoughts about our thoughts, and all this kind of higher order intentional stuff. That's one kind of intentionality. It's a representational intentionality. But all of that is arguably based upon a more primordial, a more basic or fundamental kind of intentionality, which is just a directing itself toward, without this sort of this representational kind of self-aware ego or something alongside all of this stuff. And again, that's the being absorbed in the ready-to-hand involvements and dwelling within our social practices. We talked about how there's like a coupling between Dasein and various phenomena that manifest within the world, that there are various affordances, like, entities that sort of show up in a way and solicit certain kinds of responses from Dasein in its familiarity with the world, right? So, food affords the possibility of eating. Silences afford the possibility of filling it with words in a conversation. Stairs afford the possibility of climbing, for the sake of getting to one's destination or something like that. And it's not, again, we want to remember that it's not like always a conceptual understanding of what we're doing. This is especially the case with experts in various kind of domains, or it's most obvious, I guess, in that way. We're all experts in a sense in some of the mundane tasks in life. But Hubert Dreyfus, who was a well-known Heideggerian scholar, he talks about playing basketball. And, certain players, like expert basketball players, they get in this kind of flow state. They get in the zone, so to speak. And it's almost like the ego just kind of dissolves, and it's just this sort of natural kind of flow that happens. And so Larry Bird, who's, was one of these all-star basketball guys, he would say that sometimes he wouldn't even realize that he's passed the ball until it's left his hands, right? So it's almost like there's an open player, presumably, that has their hands out and affords the possibility of passing, and it's just this sort of perceptual gestalt that, just pulls for, solicits the appropriate response. It's not mechanistic, right? Obviously, all this stuff, all of it involves mechanism and material efficient stuff, but there is a level of perceptual awareness that is not manifest in this representational form of intentionality, that we're not explicitly aware of it, though we can often make it, kind of explicit. Does that make sense? Yeah. We talked about the ready-to-hand as having an in-order-to structure. So, clocks are available to us in order to tell time. Shoes are for, wearing, and so on. And that the ready-to-hand is often holistic. So again, you walk into the classroom, you don't see all these kind of weird, strange parts and paraphernalia and materiality. You see the classroom as a whole, right? And it has a familiarity, and you just come in here and you do your thing, and you sit down and you get yourself ready. Now for other people, I think it happened a couple of times this morning, people walk into the classroom and suddenly they're stunned that there's something unfamiliar about this space, right? Is it a classroom? Yes, it's a classroom, but it's not the one that they're familiar with. Why? Because there's strange faces and the setup is kind of weird. So there can be this way in which, again, there's the necessity of a conceptual kind of making sense or interpreting, but that's often not our mode of being. And we talked about that with this absorbed way of dwelling and being in the world, it has like a from-to structure. So we attend from the engaged body to the task at hand. So again, when you're writing, you're just thinking about what you need to jot down, so that you don't forget in order to do really well on the next test or something like that. The hand movements and the pen, it dissolves into the background. Like you are not aware of it as you're engaging that task, unless there's a problem with the pen, then suddenly, you're aware of it. Okay, any questions about any of that? That kind of catches us up. So just to finish up on the ready-to-hand stuff, I'm going to move through some of this a little bit quickly because we do have the comparative psychology stuff that I think is kind of interesting, and I want to make sure that we have some time for it. I also have a video that I'm going to show that might lead to some discussion. So the ready-to-hand necessarily withdraws from thematic attention during unproblematic use. So we seldom think about the car and its various parts while driving, the piano keys or the fingering positions while playing, or the word meanings and choices when speaking. So it's like all this, familiar, intuitive understandings of how to get about in the world and how we relate to other people and so on. It dissolves in a way into the background. It's not available to our thematic attention. So when you're driving a car, right? And when you're first learning to drive a car, it's very awkward and difficult and weird, especially if you're learning how to drive like a manual transmission or something like that, and you're trying to get a feel for this sort of thing. And I'm just having a lot today. So it is something that you have to, and people tell you what you need to do, and this is the blinker, the turn signal, this is how you use it, when you use it, and this is the brake and all this other kind of stuff. But once you take on that practice and you get really skilled at it, all that stuff just absorbs into the background, right? And you could be thinking about some really complicated things as you're driving, and then you just had this dim sense of the destination that you're trying to get to, and sometimes you're surprised that you're there already, right? Because you were kind of lost in thought or something, right? And for some people, like you're driving your car, you get really good at this, you're driving your car, and you're signaling to turn, you try not to hit someone, you're fixing your glasses, and you're listening to a podcast at the same time, right? How is that possible? Well, that's only possible if some of these things, kind of recede into the background awareness.
Right. Is another way to explain this be kind of like procedural processes?
Well, so you're referring to like a procedural memory or something like that? My worry is that when we kind of slide into that terminology, my worry is that it starts to sound a little bit too much like an efficient cause phenomena. And again, it's not like suddenly you go offline and then your body does its thing or something. Like you're still present, and there are ways in which your attention can be drawn toward. We'll get into that in a second, but yeah. So circumspection involves unreflective awareness absorbed in and merging with entities that are manipulated in our purposeful activity. So again, that's just our dwelling within this sort of ready-to-hand, phenomena. So we dwell within the background familiarity of an environment and our ongoing practical activities and concerns, again, often without explicit thoughts or self-awareness. The referential totality of the ready-to-hand may vary from one culture to the next. So possibilities for action that show up as intelligible or worth doing. One of the examples that Hubert Dreyfus uses is, he goes to Japan with his girlfriend at the time, and one of them, they got their guitars and things like that, and one of them leans the guitar up against the wall, and it goes through the wall, right? Because they're kind of paper walls in, this kind of place that they were staying. And so this is, to anyone who is familiar with, these certain kinds of Japanese rooms, like it wouldn't be an error that you would ever make because you have this sort of familiarity with this is what a wall is in this culture. Whereas in, American culture or experience or familiarity, it just wouldn't even occur to one, or if it is, you have to kind of think about it and kind of, approach it in a different way. Another example is, distance standing practices. Like, different cultures have a different sense of the appropriate distance from which you can engage with someone comfortably, right? And that's not something that you're taught, right? Unless you're, again, coming from another culture that has this sort of, there's a difference, and you have to say, well, look, in this culture, this is a little bit, discomforting. We prefer to have, greater space and whatnot. So again, this is something that is just in the background, our intuitive understanding of ways of being in the world. Now, so if all this stuff is ready to hand, well, how do we get to the objects? How do we get to the things in the Cartesian sense? So, I mean, certainly that's a way of, engaging entities. So the present at hand is what he calls effectively, just things or current objects, right? They're entities encountered as spatial-temporal objects or things, material substances with various properties. Now, the present at hand is effectively revealed through the ready-to-hand during breakdown of absorbed circumspective concern. So when equipment cannot be used because it is missing or fails, the in order to assignments that are operating in the background and the referential totalities become explicitly lit up within our conscious awareness. Okay? So again, when you're just in the business of, what Dreyfus calls smooth coping, just, smooth merging with entities and engaging in just kind of flow-like activity to go about your business, you walk in through the door, you open the door, you turn the handle, you don't see the handle as a handle, it's just a, this holistic portal that you open for the sake of sitting down and finding your seat. But if the handle were to come off in your hand, now all of a sudden you see the handle as a handle, right? And you see what the handle was for. The handle was for opening the door so I can get to the classroom, or opening the door so I can exit the classroom and get to my next class, right? So it's all this stuff now explicitly becomes manifest to you during these moments of breakdown. Now you're looking at it effectively as a scientist might, right? Same thing if you're hammering, you're kind of building a deck or something, you're just picking nails, hammering, and then suddenly the head of the hammer falls off, right? And now all of a sudden, so the hammer was just absorbed in your background activity. It becomes an extension of your arm or something like that, right? But when it breaks down, now suddenly you're staring at it as just a thing that fails to, to work in the way that it needs to. So we now see for the first time what the missing article was ready to hand with, what it was ready to hand for, and with this totality, the world announces itself. Entities are now seen as present at hand. Objects are things with properties. And this is the case with equipment. This is the case with how we often use language and words. If you use words that you've seen on paper, but you've maybe never tried to say it out loud, and you're kind of clumsy with the pronunciation, and then you're kind of wondering, like, well, is this the right word? Am I using it, and saying it right? And sort of there's a kind of breakdown that happens, and you're kind of analyzing it, right? Whereas most of us, when we're speaking, like the words they're just in the background flow of activity. Like you're dwelling again from your familiarity with a language to whatever point you're trying to make or what you're trying to do in your engagements with other people. We can also make words, really strange by separating them from their everyday context, right? So we can, if we take a word like pencil, and if we say pencil, 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 there's a certain point in which the word, ripped out of any context that we would normally use it in, it becomes strange. It starts to sound like it loses all meaning. It's just like this utterance or something like that, this strange, odd kind of thing. Does that make sense? Okay. So the ready to hand is also embedded within our lived social practices, and there can be forms of social breakdown. So the present at hand is likewise able to announce itself. We become explicitly aware of something as something that is as something in that representational kind of intentional sense, as something thematized, as something that we can conceptualize. I can't remember what this study was about. Maybe you guys know, but there was a social psychology experiment where I guess they had these people that were part of the experiment kind of go into an elevator, and they would have a bunch of them kind of turn the opposite way. So normally we face the doors in the elevator. They would have them turn the opposite way, and they would analyze or look at someone's response as they sort of encountered this strange thing, right? Does anyone remember what that was for, what that was about?
It was like conforming to the norm, I think.
Right, okay.
I can't remember who did it.
Yeah, and that's very appropriate to what we're talking about here. So there's this normal way of doing things, like this social, like a social familiarity. You get on an elevator, it never occurs to you, like, oh, isn't it odd that, we all face, I mean, you might if you're in a particularly contemplative mood, but most of the time you wouldn't notice that unless there's some kind of breakdown that something kind of lights up as odd or bizarre, and now it's something that you can conceptualize and consider more explicitly. So again, the main point is our objective theoretical mode is not the most basic or familiar way of being in the world. It's instead derived from the ready to hand. So the most basic way of being in the world is this sort of ready to hand, just sort of tacit knowing how to engage with entities and within the world in our social practices. And this heady conceptual type stuff is effectively built upon all of that, right? Just quickly on being in the world. So again, the being in the world is this unitary phenomena. We're always already in a world in the Heideggerian sense. The connotations also connote activity of existing. So there's a present at hand being in the way that water is in a glass. This is like the Cartesian coordinates, right, in this homogeneous space. versus being of Dasein as existing. And it expresses its involvements, such as being in love, being in business, being in this class, being in debt, being in trouble, this kind of stuff. And we need to have some way of accounting for this. So the world is not something that we are not, rather the world is our situated psychological and physical environment. It's a referential totality within which our concern dwells. Now, part of being in the world, or part of that referential totality, involves signs. And this is sort of a complicated little bit, but it kind of goes something like this, that signs are effectively ready-to-hand equipment that have the nature of showing or indicating. It's a kind of referring wherein one's concern dwells and amid a referential whole or totality of involvements. So just some examples of that. So sneezing is a sign, or can be taken as a sign, of a possible cold and a need to drink fluids and wash one's hands. If we see that phenomena in another person, it's a sign that we need to steer clear of this person or wash our hands after coming into contact with them. A weather vane indicates, to the farmer at least, high winds, a possible storm, and a need to harvest field crops. So we can see that what is taken or interpreted as a sign will vary by the individual and how they are situated within a particular world structure, right? So a farmer may interpret this phenomenon in one way, whereas an electrical engineer might interpret it in another way, right? Or wouldn't have that same sense of meaning or significance. Fresh deer tracks to the hunter signify a possible trophy, a meal, and so on. To just a nature lover, it may signify a beautiful sighting if they're fortunate enough to encounter the deer. And a black veil is a sign of someone in mourning and necessitates moments of quiet reflection. Now the veil is also operating at a symbolic level too. It's not just indicating. So depending on the culture, it has a kind of additional kind of symbolic connotation or meaning. So a sign is not grasped by staring at it and as an occurrent thing, nor is it merely a relation of one thing to another. A sign is what it is within a context of shared practical activity, that is the world, and when taken up and used in our circumspective, concernful activity. So again, circumspection is just our absorbed coping, our absorbed dwelling within a community, within an environment of the ready to hand. And often, again, usually without thematic awareness. So you can interpret a sign, I think this is what Heidegger would say, you can interpret a sign on a conceptual level, like I'm aware that I'm interpreting this sign as such, but you can also, interpret a sign in a pre-thematized or like just an intuitive kind of way, right? So does anyone remember that show? Maybe this is too old for you guys. Manhunter. There's this guy who's really good at tracking, and he would have these people run off into the wilderness, and he would be, tracking these individuals, and he'd be looking at snapped twigs and kind of little kind of, things out of joint or something like that, or tracks and things. Now, is he always aware of the things that he's interpreting? I don't think so. I think someone, who has a particular skill in a domain like that, I think he just, much of the time, just has this intuitive feel, like there's a part of him that interprets something as a sign, but he may not be conceptually kind of aware of it. Now, that can be brought to awareness, perhaps. Like if someone says, my God, how did you know? How did you go from this point? They covered their tracks and they did this and whatever. How did you know to look over there? And then he might be able to articulate that in some way, but not necessarily. And maybe there's just something that is just such a skill that is beyond anything that you could explicitly state. I mean, doing therapy is kind of like that. You've been doing therapy for a while, sometimes you just have this intuitive sense of what needs to happen or what's going on, and it's very difficult to try to put that into words, right? And sometimes you're not even aware of it. Like sometimes, I don't know if you can imagine, but sometimes therapists have bad therapy days, right? Like we're human. And so, in some sense, like our thought processes are kind of not working optimally, and yet like our body does what it needs to do, and it's able to engage with this person in a way that is nonetheless therapeutic. So again, you're dwelling within your body or within those practices to kind of engage with the task at hand. So just to kind of finish up on this bit, being in the world, so ourselves are both first-person singular and first-person plural. So we dwell within a shared subjectivity, a referential whole, a totality of significances, or what Raymond Tallis calls a community of minds. And that's constituted by our language, our culture, signs and symbols, shared meanings, reasons and artifacts, tools, and being with others. Now, part of our being is, again, a being with others, and we are largely defined by the other, in a strange way. So we talked about, different kinds of constraints. There are biological constraints. There are also social or cultural constraints. So again, you are immersed within a particular culture, and much of who you are is defined by the other. We'll get into this a little bit later, but there's this an existential that is effectively the one or the they, right? And it is essentially, it's not who you are not. It is a part of you that is undifferentiated by other people, So average everyday Dasein for Heidegger has no self. It's not owned. It's sort of inauthentic, right? And authenticity is, these kind of more rare achievements that is within the realm of what we're capable of, but much of the time we find ourselves absorbed in, this kind of conformity or this way of being. It's interesting, I just had this kind of Heideggerian moment not too long ago. Like when I'm, trying to teach my kids, right, I tend to say things like, look, get off the couch, stop climbing on the couch, or, don't eat with your hands, eat with the fork, this kind of thing. But my wife has a different way of doing it, where she says, we don't climb on the couch, we don't eat with our hands. And then I was thinking like, well, who is the we, right? And isn't it like she's really a representative of the one, right? And essentially saying like, one does not climb on the couch, one does not eat with one's hands, right? And who is the one? The one is the anyone, right? The undifferentiated, But I want to move on to comparative psychology. So hopefully you guys are on board that the human being is very, very complex. Hopefully I've convinced you in some ways that we're not just mere computers or robots. And by the end of this class, hopefully some of you will have some appreciation of how we might be different from other non-human animals. Heidegger has, again, very little to say about the way in which we are different from animals. Again, he's open to the possibility, presumably, that non-human animals have Dasein. But he does kind of speculate a little bit and offer some suggestions that are interesting. So he says, the stone is worldless, the animal is poor in world, the human is world-forming. Again, just you have to keep in mind that we're not talking about like some Cartesian world, that we can know independent of people or something like that. We're talking about the world within which we inhabit, the kind of world that we are capable of inhabiting, right? I'm just going to read you a little passage from Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. And he just has some kind of interesting things to say here. He's talking about the difference between the stone, and then he's talking about a lizard, as a lizard might sit on a stone. He says, it is true that the rock on which the lizard lies is not given for the lizard as a rock, in such a way that it could inquire into its mineralogical constitution, for example. It is true that the sun in which it is basking is not given for the lizard as sun, in such a way that it could ask questions of astrophysics about it and expect to find the answers. But it is not true to say that the lizard merely crops up as a present at hand beside the rock, amongst other things such as the sun, for example, in the same way as the stone lying nearby is simply present at hand amongst other things. On the contrary, the lizard has its own relation to the rock, to the sun, and to a host of other things. One is tempted to suggest that what we identify as the rock and the sun are just lizard things for the lizard, so to speak. When we say that the lizard is lying on the rock, we ought to cross out the word rock in order to indicate that whatever the lizard is lying on is certainly given in some way for the lizard, and yet is not known to the lizard as a rock. If we cross out the word, we do not simply mean to imply that something else is in question here or is taken as something else. Rather, we imply that whatever it is not accessible to it as a being. The blade of grass that the beetle crawls up, for example, is not a blade of grass for it at all. It is not something possibly destined to become part of the bundle of hay with which the peasant will feed his cow. The blade of grass is simply a beetle path on which the beetle specifically seeks beetle nourishment and not just any edible matter in general. So that's, are you guys following any little bits of that? So that's kind of interesting, right? So he's saying, well, again, just more or less this, that the stone, or arguably the computer, the robot, like is worldless. It doesn't have a world. The lizard, the beetle, has some sense of something. It's intelligible to ask the question, what is it like to be a lizard? What is it like to be a beetle? Arguably, that's a reasonable question to pose. But is it able to appropriate its situation in the way that human beings are, in this conceptual way? We can think about this, I think, as the representational level of intentionality. Is it able to do that? Arguably not. So we are ontologically distinct, so our way of being is distinct from the stone and the computer in our capacity for inhabiting a world. We are distinguished arguably from non-human animals in our capacity for dwelling within these diverse sociocultural environments, and in that we create the very worlds that we inhabit. So I'm just drawing a little bit here from Terence Deacon's work. He had written a book called The Symbolic Species, and what he does is he borrows from C.S. Peirce's breakdown of the sign into an index, an icon, and a symbol, and he's suggesting that there are different ways or gradations, I guess, ways that animals utilize these different kind of signs or references or ways of interpreting, and we can get a little bit of insight into the differences between humans and non-human animals by breaking down these different phenomena. So one of the, arguably the most basic, at least at the level of perception or interpretation of some experience of some sort, is at the level of the icon, which is a sign that physically resembles what it stands for. So it's mediated by a perceived similarity between a signifier. So in this case, we're using a shark example, a human on a surfboard, and what it signifies. So to the shark, presumably it signifies in some way a turtle or a seal or a meal or something like that. Again, would we suggest that the shark sees it as a turtle or a seal in some conceptual way? I don't think we need to do that. I don't think we have to go to that point. You can problematize that really quickly when concepts are embedded in language. Primarily, right? We think in terms of language. Where's language? Well, language is part of that sociocultural kind of referential whole within which we dwell. So in a sense, it's failing to make a perceptual distinction between a signifier and the object or the event that it signifies. And a human example would be you're going out on a hike and you're kind of going around a nature trail, and then suddenly you see something on the ground, you jump back, and I guess a part of you interpreted that as a snake or something, when really it was just a crooked stick that was lying across the path. So that's the level of the icon. An index involves a mediation by perceived spatial or temporal connection between the signifier, and one example that we might use is the vervet monkey calls, and the object or the event that is signified. So I don't know if you probably learned this in other classes, that the vervet monkeys have at least 3 different calls. a call to signify a leopard or an eagle or a snake. And that kind of triggers this sort of reflexive response that all the monkeys in the troop start kind of, engaging in the same signal, and it causes, appropriate responses. So if there's a leopard call, then, they would all rush up to the trees. If there's an eagle call, they would, rush down and scramble under, the bushes and things like that. If it's a snake call, then they would stand up on their back legs and kind of look around in the tall grass. So there's, again, a spatial temporal kind of connection, right, a referring in that way. It involves a perceived contiguity, a correlation, or kind of like an efficient causal kind of connection. So it can be somewhat reflexive and arguably innate, such as the vervet monkey calls. Another example for humans is laughter. This is an example that Deacon uses, crying, or it could be voluntary and learned. So we're kind of clumping together some disparate phenomena. But so early theorists would say that, well, the vervet monkeys, this is a proto-language or something like that they're engaging with. But I think a more sober interpretation is that, no, it's not, because it's, language is in some sense arbitrary, right? Like you can kind of change the words. I mean, this is just, if you go to, very different cultures and communities, like there's different languages, right, to represent the same idea, the same phenomena. The vervet monkeys are not able to kind of use, for example, the call that is typically used for the leopard and kind of switch it and use that for, the snake or something like that. And, vervet monkeys, they don't engage in, kind of like using a call as a practical joke or something like that, right, on other vervet monkeys. And there's this other weird thing that, you'd think that, okay, well, once the call is put out there, that if the monkey is able to kind of notice that the other monkeys are all safe, then they would stop doing the call. But they don't seem to do that. It's almost like just a reflexive kind of thing that they all just kind of do it until all this energy kind of settles down. And that's kind of like human laughter in a way, right? But you might say, well, in what way is human laughter indexical? How does it reference or how does it point? Well, if we have someone who just kind of walks in through the door and they're just having a big belly laugh, I mean, in a way we can say, wow, this person's in a jolly mood. But there's also a way in which it kind of points to whatever the hell's going on out in the hallway. It's like, it looks like a fun time. It points back toward an environment that is like safe or fun or comfortable or jolly or whatever that happens to be. So there's this tacit causal structure, again, in the efficient causal sense, where in the case of a dog, like a sit command is arguably caused by the signified, which is the anticipation of a treat or a reward. So some animals exhibit associative learning and an indexical kind of pointing toward or referencing some other spatial temporal phenomena where one object or event is perceived as pointing toward or going together with another. So we look at the parrot example. The parrot says, Polly wants a cracker, which coincides with food. Would we say that Polly knows that its name is Polly, what a cracker is, or the meaning of this apparent request? I don't think so. I don't think we would be willing to say that at all. An animal need not explicitly know that these two things go together, or it need not be, it can be understood tacitly. It doesn't need to grasp the symbolic meaning or the significance within some larger referential context. So, I mean, one of the reasons why the parrot example is so persuasive in a way is that it's mimicking human language, right? And so we as human beings interpret it, oh, Polly does indeed want a cracker, right? And we do that sort of thing, but that doesn't mean that Polly understands at all. An interesting thing to know about parrots is that whatever their environment is, they just kind of parrot back what they hear. So if you have a parrot in some busy street in New York, they're going to start parroting back like the sounds of the cars and noises outside and things like that, right? It only seems like amazing and astounding to us when they're parroting back language that we can understand and make sense of, and it fits with a larger kind of context of intelligibility for us, not necessarily for the parrot. A wily catfish is able to sort of discern in some ways, what is food from the not food, as in like something that is likely to get it hooked, right? And if it's had that sort of experience, it can kind of have some dim sense of how these things are not the same, or how one thing is related to a bad outcome. But it doesn't mean that they conceptualize it. It doesn't mean that they have thoughts about oh, this is the wily kind of fisherman up there trying a new bait today, and good luck, buddy. And there's nothing like that. And the catfish is not going to communicate to other catfishes about this experience so that they can learn from it, and so on. Again, that is arguably beyond the pale of what's happening at this level. Now, Deacon argues that really only human beings are dwelling in the world at the level of the symbolic. I mean, you can haggle a little bit about, the chimps and dolphins and things like that. We'll hopefully do a little bit of that in a minute. But so with the symbolic, the signifier has a mere arbitrary or agreed upon link to the thing that is signified. So it's based on background cultural practices and social conventions. So again, language in a certain sense is arbitrary. Various rituals that we engage in, various artifacts, right? Like a wedding ring, signifies or means, a sense of commitment, right, to one's partner, to other potential kind of partners, or whatever it means, unavailable, this kind of thing. Why does it have to be a ring? Why does it have to be, on a finger? Why does it have to be on the left hand? Like it means one thing on the left hand, but it means another thing on the right hand. Like all this stuff is, in a sense, arbitrary, right? But we can, it's intelligible to us as long as we're dwelling within that symbolic community. So it looks like we had some technical difficulties with the audio. So I lost the audio partway through that lecture, which was kind of disappointing because now I have to try to finish that lecture, and now I'm staring at a video camera as opposed to interacting with people or seeing faces that are trying to digest some of what I'm laying out there. So I'm going to try to finish this. We left off on the symbolic, and again, like one way of looking at it is that it's part of formal cause. It's part of that referential totality of involvements, and it's part of what allows something to show up as the thing that it is. It's part of the intelligibility for one who dwells within a given culture. So it embodies meaning or significance as it relates to our circumspective practical activity. It arguably evolved alongside other forms of mental reference, other modes of communication. So according to Terence Deacon, the more fundamental levels of interpretation or perception are operating within the realm of iconicity and indexicality. The level of the symbolic is, it's not something that's replaced everything else, but has evolved alongside. And again, this is part of what allows us to create these worlds that we inhabit, and we kind of are, again, dwelling within, we're instantiated within this formal cause phenomena. The other thing I just wanted to mention before moving on to the next section is language. So language, it functions as a sociocultural constraint. So again, you are thrown into a language, a domain of language users, a particular language, and you're taught to manipulate these symbolic abstractions in a very particular way. So it's a restricted range of symbolic actions. It's a linguistic room for maneuver, if you will, into which we are thrown, within which we dwell, and wherein significance, that is intelligibility, is made manifest. So, again, there are constraints on the biological level, there are constraints on the sociocultural level, and there are constraints with regard to, the words that have some sense of intelligibility in a given culture. But within that realm, within that range, now there's the possibility of some movement and an ability to sort of rebel against language in a way. So different concepts or different phenomena, you can state it in language, but being able to do so, the kind of being that we are beings that are capable of oppositionality or dialectical kind of reasoning capacity. We can always infer from what is, the not or the negation of what is. And so we can kind of bounce off of, various conceptual phenomena to create new meanings and interpretations, and challenge some of the cultural assumptions that we maybe pick up. So the symbolic world of language enables discourse with others and with ourselves, and that's effectively what thinking is, having a conversation with yourself. I was going to do this whole bit on animals and language and symbol use as it relates to the parrot. I was going to show how, what a parrot is doing as it relates to, quote, understanding concepts and manipulating concepts and so on, could really be interpreted via operant conditioning principles. But I'm not going to get into that. I didn't have time in the class to get into that, and I'm not going to review that here. But what I will get into is a couple things. So first of all, as we're looking at the kind of being that we are, and trying to infer ways in which we might be similar or dissimilar from other animals, we want to be careful that we don't succumb to a kind of anthropomorphism, which is assuming that if other animals perform the same kinds of behaviors, they do so for the same reasons as human beings. So it's very likely that that they may have a different kind of I don't like the term, but a different kind of mind or a different way of being in the world. And one of these axioms that is put forward by, it's referred to as Morgan's canon. It goes something like this: in no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of an exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted as the outcome of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. So just because a chimp or a dog is able to do something that looks similar to what we humans are doing, we shouldn't infer that it's the same phenomena. It could be very well, it could be very different. Otherwise, we might be inclined to believe that a squirrel stores nuts because it knows that winter is coming and that it's going to be a long time before spring, or that my dog understands the meaning of the word come versus the more likely scenario of it being operantly reinforced. So what looks like future-oriented behavior in other animals is often nothing more than a sophisticated and inherited instinct or behavior that was associatively learned. In class I showed this video, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to embed the video here, and maybe I'll just kind of link to it. But it's a 15-minute video breaking down through experiments like some of the differences between chimps and human beings as it relates to symbol use. So I'm going to show that now.
Join me as we compare chimps and humans to find out what humans have that chimps don't. An eagerness to please, a delight in teaching and learning, a desire to help, and the joy of joining in.
Putting all that stuff together, I think, is what it is to be human. So what we're left doing is looking at their behavior and trying to make guesses about what's going on in terms of why they're different based on their behavior. And so we do that doing experiments. And a lot of times what happens is we're completely humbled.
Here it comes again. Look, now he's kicking. Look.
All right.
He's kicking, too.
Because people will make hypotheses and say, Hondo here cannot do X. There's no way, and this is what makes us human. And it ends up that we go
and then they come and they see him playing poker.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. But then sometimes we get lucky and we find something that really stumps these guys.
Okay, so this is Apollo.
Hey, Apollo.
So I've come to the University of Louisiana to visit a research facility well known for stumping chimpanzees.
If it's a heavy one, he's supposed to put it in the tray on his right, the blue
Very
one.
good.
The man who runs this lab and who believes his experiments prove chimps' minds are very different from ours is Danny Pavanelli.
So it was heavy and he put it in the blue tray.
That's right.
The chimps have been looked after since they were babies by Anthony Rideau. Danny calls Anthony the chimp whisperer because of his rapport with the animals. But even Anthony takes no chances with security, for which I'm about to be very grateful.
Okay, so now this time it's a light object, and he can't know that until he picks it up. Oh, he got it wrong.
Nope, sorry. Try again.
Come on, fellow. You know where it goes. Get down. Down.
That's what I call an exit.
Apollo obviously needs a break, and so he's replaced for the moment by Megan and her new baby.
Good job. Very good. Very good. Good girl.
She just got the light one correct, and schedule calls for her to get the heavy one now. We're going to see if she knows what to do with it. Okay, so Megan's going to come in. It's a heavy object.
Megan had a lot of practice sorting heavy and light objects, and she needed it.
Good job, Megan.
It takes them hundreds of trials. On average, it took our chimps about 800 trials to learn how to sort reliably just this first set of objects. And then you give a new set and a new set.
And the second set, would that take fewer trials?
It takes a fewer trials, like maybe 400.
And at what point, how many times do they have to go through this before they get the idea that you can generalize about heavy and light?
Well, I don't think they ever get the idea that you can generalize about heavy and light. I think eventually what happens is that their bodies become sensitive instruments to heaviness and lightness, and so their bodies know what to do with the objects.
How does that differ from us? I mean, how do we know that we don't have that same signal from our bodies that we interpret as heavy or light?
Well, we do, and that's the fascinating thing about studying the similarities and differences between chimps. It's because most of the time, I think we're acting pretty much like chimps. Humans didn't discard the old chimp-like or ape-like way of understanding the world. We wove into our minds these additional high-level concepts. Hey, buddy, look at this. This is gonna be fun. Come on, let's go. Look, let me show you. Why don't you grab this right here? Let me show you where this one goes. This one goes right there. All righty. Let me show you where this one goes. Yeah, go ahead, grab it. This one goes. That's right. That's right.
So this is interesting. He immediately sensed it was different.
That's right.
And would probably go in the other one.
That's right.
I mean, he's never done this before, right?
No, but there's two options, and I think already at this age 3, they're already beginning to see this as a problem to be solved with 2 solutions, which we never told him.
Yeah.
But just looking at this situation, he's bringing that scheme to bear on it, something that may be well outside the understanding of chimpanzees.
Right.
So it took Russell less than 1 trial to pick up on a concept it takes chimps hundreds of trials to learn.
Oh, hey, very good.
In fact, Danny argues, chimps actually never seem to get the concept of heavy and light.
Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. And now we can test her and ask her if she knows which one to roll down the ramp when she picks them up.
Candy gets to feel how heavy each ball is as she picks it up. But still,
Just gets one choice. Okay, we'll get it right next time, Candy. We'll get it right next time.
Oh, she takes the ball with her.
Oh, that one didn't work, did it? No. Let's try this one. Let's see if this one works. Whoa, that one worked, didn't it?
Can I try?
Yeah. Okay, Gracie, go get him and bring him over here. Okay, so we want to do that so they can actually feel the... Okay, and why don't you put him on here? Okay, perfect. Okay, can you get it out of there? Hey, good job. Boy, that was
Strong
great.
ball. I used the strong ball.
Use the strong ball.
I know which one was the strong one.
You
That
did?
was right there.
How did you know which one was the strong one?
I put it there.
Oh, you did put it there. How could you tell which one's the strong one? Come see. Tell me which one's the strong one.
This one.
Oh, what, you didn't even touch that one. How do you know that one's not strong?
It's because. Watch.
Huh.
It's not even strong. It's not even strong. That one's strong.
now it's my turn to get into the act. With Apollo looking meaner than ever, I certainly hope Anthony's tightened those bolts.
Whoa, so light. Whoa. This is for you. Now here comes the really heavy.
Apollo has to do is choose which rope to pull. As always, he only gets one try.
Maybe I didn't show him that was light enough.
Well, imagine you were a creature who didn't have a concept of heavy and light. I mean, you just didn't think in abstract terms like this.
Yeah.
Well, what would be your explanation for why one box moves when I pull on it and the other one doesn't?
Well, see, there would be some unseen being who was keeping me.
I'm taking all that away from you now. You see, in my thought experiment, you're actually a chimp, and you don't have that kind of level of abstraction.
Well, how do you know? I mean, how do you know that they don't say every time, there's the great unseen being again?
Well, it could be, but then if that were true, why don't they learn it just as rapidly?
Okay, let's get this down here. This time we have a panel of kids.
On three.
One, two, three.
Can you go get a Play-Doh? Good job! Go get one. Good job, Gracie. Go ahead, Camille. She's like, oh, this is not it. Okay. Okay. So which one's the heavy one?
Well,
How did you know that?
because when Mr. Allen held it, his hand went down.
And concepts about weight, heavy and light, at that level of abstraction, are no different than concepts about something as abstract as love. When Camille is holding her kitten, and the kitten is purring and she's stroking it, and she loves her kitten. When a young boy hands a young girl a rose, when a husband and wife put their arms around each other and bring their lips together, what's the same about all of those at a perceptual level? Not much. But at a deep underlying abstract level, our minds are able to bridge and say, oh, it's love.
So Danny Pavanelli sees the human spark, the essential difference between us and chimpanzees, in our ability for abstract thought.
Chimps have concepts. They form representations of the world in their head about what's likely to happen if I try to take that treat away from the dominant animal. Okay, Jadine knows what's going to happen if she takes that treat away from Apollo. She's going to get hit. Is she aware of knowing it? Can she step back and reflect on her thoughts the way you and I can? I don't think so. So what are some of the fundamental differences, the kind of thoughts we can have that they don't have? Well, I'm going to tell you my best guess. And it's a young field. Who knows what the truth is? But it seems as if chimps don't have the ability to reason about unobservable things. They can reason about all the things in the world that they can touch, that they can taste, that they can see, but they don't reason about abstract things like God, ghosts, gravity, that sort of thing. They don't invent the unobservable to explain the observable.
The question is, can they say, okay, I'm thinking about his thoughts, I'm thinking about what does he think about me, and then I'm also projecting into the future, and I'm thinking, what is it that I want, and also I'm thinking about what is it that I'm feeling, and what will I be feeling, and what should I do now? So that's really complicated, and putting all that stuff together, I think, is what it is to be human. We don't know each other that well. We're strangers to each other, but we're working together right now to try to explain this to people. And not only that, but we're motivated to interact with one another in a way that these guys aren't. For a chimpanzee who doesn't, particularly for a male chimpanzee who doesn't know another male chimpanzee, for the two of them to get together, sit down, and work together on a problem, it's just about impossible.
Even Franz de Waal, the foremost proponent of our continuity with chimps, acknowledges that this is one realm where we're very different.
So humans actually have already a capacity to get along with their neighbors more than chimps do. But then in addition, in our modern society, that's of course unprecedented what we do. Is if you would put 10 million chimps in New York City, you know, I don't think you would have the same kind of city. There would be a bloodbath, basically.
If you look from the outside, the things that make humans really different are things like complex technology, symbol systems like language and mathematics, and social institutions like governments and religions. And the question is, what does it take to participate in these things?
Everything we call civilization depends upon individuals cooperating and collaborating, communicating. And that depends on our uniquely sophisticated language skills. We'll be exploring how the human brain permits language in the next program. But first, Mike Tomasello has an intriguing take on language's origins.
Okay, now let me ask you something. It seems that language, for a lot of people, is a major thing that divides us from the other animals.
There's absolutely a lot of truth in that, but I actually think that it goes a little bit deeper than that. Saying that only humans have language is kind of like saying only humans have skyscrapers, when in fact, only humans among primates actually build any shelters at all. So yes, language, but actually it goes deeper than that. And I've been focused a lot lately on pointing. If I point to that car, you look over there and you say, why does he think that car should be interesting to me? The assumption is I'm doing it for your interest and your benefit. And other species don't do that anywhere near the same extent, where it's got a cooperative motive behind it, and it happens in this cooperative framework. And that is, I think, the first step on uniquely human communication, and language is built on top of that.
Und ich versteckte ihn, ja?
Pointing is such a simple and natural human gesture, it's hard to see it as a foundation for human cooperation.
Da ist der Hase.
It doesn't look like much of a test because you point to something and there it is. So it doesn't seem so hard for us, right?
It's obvious to us, but what happens is the child follows the point, and all they see is a boring cup. And it looks just like the other cup.
Yeah.
So what's special about this cup?
Yeah.
And then they make the inference, oh, you must be trying to help me find the toy. And so there's an inference of helping, that you're helping me find it.
Of all the experiments we've seen comparing chimp skills to humans, this is the simplest and perhaps the most startling. When the human points to the cup hiding the food, chimps just don't get that the human is trying to help. Chimpanzees, so much closer to us genetically and possessing so many other fragments of the human spark in their intelligence and social guile, are missing that sense of collective purpose, that ability to create social institutions like religions and governments and cities and theater and music, even zoos, that have me on one side of the glass and Hondo still showing his uncivilized side on the other.
So I guess one of the big takeaways from those series of experiments is to suggest that chimpanzees are almost like they're able to grasp some kind of ready-to-hand, intuitive understanding or a bodily know-how that they can demonstrate after like hundreds and hundreds of trials to sort out, for example, the heavy and light, but they don't ever get to that conceptual level of understanding. Arguably, it's that sort of representational level of intentionality. So they don't ever seem to be capable of doing that. And that's illustrated, I guess, most obviously in their inability to symbolically point. So they can point toward things that they can see physically and things that they want, but they don't point in a way that, is indicating something that is not there, or something that requires an observer to infer, some joint attention or something of significance. So I remember reading another study, and where it's really obviously kind of drawn out some of the differences. So there's a study where there's a glass pane of some kind, and behind it there are two big piles of, there's a pile of candy, a big pile of candy, and there's a small little pile of 2 or 3 candies. And at first there'd be children that they're comparing this to, and chimpanzees, and they would have the task would be to point to whichever pile you want. And the children would point to the big pile, they'd get the big pile of candy. The chimpanzees would point to the big pile, they get the big pile of candy. So again, they're able to point to what they want, what they can see. But then at a certain point in the experiment, they switch the task, or they switch the conditions of reward, so that you have to point to the small pile in order to get the big pile of candy. And within 2 or 3 trials, the children would very quickly kind of pick up on what is happening here and what they need to do to get the big pile of candy. The chimpanzees, though, never seem to get this. And actually, you can see them get, or apparently from the study, they get quite frustrated in not being able to get the big pile of candy when they're pointing at the big pile of candy. So they don't get that symbolic mode of pointing. Now, so there's something about this, and the idea is that this symbolic pointing or gesturing to something that is not there there's something about that seems to be like the foundation from which language is built. So it's not just that humans have language, it's that humans are able to communicate symbolically, and other animals arguably are not able to do that. Now, some people, we talked about, well, are there not other animals that do seem to get symbolic pointing? And some people can guess, well, dogs seem to be able to do that. If you point to something, many dogs will look at whatever, they'll follow the finger and what it seems to be gesturing toward. And so this would suggest to some people that dogs are able to engage in symbolic reference. But there's been some interesting studies done, I think it's by Tomasello's research camp, that suggests that it's not that the dog is getting what it means to reference something symbolically. They're actually just highly sensitized to human gestures and the human gaze. And, so the dog is, through evolution and through our, shaping the dog and our, the dog's evolving alongside, symbolic, human beings and the importance of attending to, the interests of human beings and so on. They just get highly sensitized to that. And there's this interesting study where they are able to, so again, the dog is able to follow a human's line of sight or a human gesture, but when they compared what domesticated dogs can do to wolves, what they found is that wolves lack this ability. They do not, seem to engage in following the human gaze or understanding the symbolic point in the way that a dog does. Again, the dog doesn't understand it symbolically. There's just something going on where it's able to track what the human being is doing. And then the same study kind of points to, other kinds of, more difficult mental tasks that the chimpanzees get and the dogs do not get. And so it does seem to suggest that there's something else going on with the dog. And all of this is to, again, reinforce that there is something unique about the human being and our way of dwelling within the world, our way of being in a world. And again, going back to that Heideggerian sort of set of propositions that, the rock or the stone is worldless, arguably the computer or the robot is worldless. The animal is poor in world, so they have a capacity for world, but not nearly to the extent as a human being. The human being is world forming. We create the worlds in which we inhabit. And so the realm of formal cause, to whatever extent animals, can engage in some kind of formal cause conceptualizations of their, what they can perceive and what they can interpret, human beings are just at a whole different level. And so there is a sense in which, like, a difference in capacity sort of opens up a whole difference in kind. So hopefully that sort of helps bridge the gap, the things that we missed from the lecture. And next, we're going to be introducing, a different way of looking at emotions and the way that we are, sort of inhabiting a world, how we're dialed into a world emotionally. Okay, thanks.